Just do the basics, they say. That's all you need. You just need the basic foundational exercises and you'll be good to go, right? If you've been in and around fitness, bodybuilding, whatever the hell this space is, for any length of time, you've probably heard people say that, I don't know, at least 100 times. And usually the just do the basics argument is stated as if it's some kind of counterpoint to any degree of nuance or context. So the minute that you say biomechanics, the minute that you start to talk about the way that a muscle can be biased, let's say, people automatically revert. Typically, by the way, people who have some kind of weird allergic reaction to discussing anything substantive or intellectual, they revert to this argument of just do the basics. And I think this is dumb. And I think it's dumb for a bunch of different reasons. So I'm going to try to address them in no particular order here. The first reason it's dumb is because if you ask anyone who makes this claim, this argument in quotations, like, hey, oh, okay, I'll do the basics for sure, bro. What are the basics? Typically, not even typically, I have never gotten a response that was different from the following response: exercise A, exercise B, exercise C, exercise D, etc. All right, so people will basically respond to the question of what are the basics with names of exercises: squats, deadlifts, hinges, pushes, pulls, vertical and horizontal, curls, extend. And I'm like, okay. All right, so you've just listed a bunch of exercises and you've told me that they're the basics, implying that they're things that everyone should do and needs to do in order to get results. So basically what you're saying is the basics are what you decide, right? And if you think about that for just like half of a second, that response, which again is the only response I've ever gotten, is just to list some kind of specific pattern or category of exercise. If you just think about that response for half of a second, you'll realize like, oh, this person's just stating their opinion about what they like. And maybe at a level wider than that, they're stating what other people have stated are the basics. Typically, it's not their own belief. It's a belief that's being regurgitated. Because if you imagine you appeared randomly on a desert island and you had access to a bunch of different machines and dumbbells and boom, you just got plopped there. Imagine you live on that island for a year and someone comes to you and they're like, hey, what are the basics of exercise? You'd be like, well, this is like what I've done for the last year, not knowing anything about anything or names of whatever this thing is or that thing is. Kind of a silly situation there, but you get my point, hopefully. Okay, so that's kind of first thing, number one, that comes to mind, which is this idea that like there are basics and that those basics are specific exercises. Again, I'll repeat, mostly those are just subjective experiences that people are reporting and they're saying you have to do this because this is what's been done and this is what's worked. And I think there's something to that, to give at least some credit to the argument. It's kind of like, okay, if you want to become muscular, kind of makes sense to like do what other people have done and what other people have report to have worked. Kind of makes sense on some level. But in this day and age, in the day and age where we are able to think through these things and discuss context and discuss actual mechanics, all of that to me just falls way, way short of anything that would actually be the basics, right? Because whatever the basics are, if we humor that term for just a second, they are by definition fundamental, meaning that they are not things that apply to people. They're not subjective. They're not subjective reports. They're not subjective descriptions of exercise. They are objective qualities that exist within exercise, within lifting, within mechanics, within physics, that apply universally. So when we say, oh, what are the basics, we should be talking about things that are much sort of further down toward the base of the pyramid. Naming specific exercises is at least somewhat close to the top of the pyramid. So, and the reason you know this, by the way, is that whenever you're talking about basics of a topic, let's say in education, you're talking about foundations of a topic. You're not talking about specific contexts within the domain of education of a topic. Because the basics, by definition, they're principle based, they're broad, they don't trap you, right? So when people say just do the basics and then they follow it up with something like do pull downs, do rows, do presses, whatever, it's not necessarily like it's bad advice, but by definition, if you've named specific things and you've called them the basics, well, that would mean that everyone would need to be doing them. And in my understanding, not everyone actually needs to do any motion, regardless of how foundational you think it is. So if you say, well, you must do squats, like squats are the basics. I'm like, okay, well, what does a squat accomplish? And can we train the muscles that the squat trains in other ways? Yes, you can. Okay, so when we talk about basics, the basics, whatever they are, they can't trap you. Because if you say, oh, the basics are the squats, everyone should be doing squats, but why? Why is that the case? Can you accomplish the goals that you would accomplish with a squat with another exercise? If you're training your quads, you could do a leg extension, right? If you're training your glutes, you could do a hip thrust. The list goes on. You want to train your adductor, you could do the seated adduction. So the basics, by definition, they can't trap you. They're too broad. They're too fundamental. So now the question is, well, what are the basics? And how do we actually make the basics helpful? Well, the second part of that question is the difficult part, because you actually have to learn stuff. God forbid people learn stuff instead of just repeating trite quips, trite aphorisms, and bullshit that they've heard other people espouse. Well, the basics most fundamentally in exercise have to be rooted in physics, right? And most specifically, this concept of force. What is a force? It's a push or a pull. Put simply, a force has two major qualities. It has a point of contact on you, and it has some direction that it's pushing or pulling you. So if I'm doing a dumbbell curl, the contact is in my hand, and if I'm doing a curling action, well, that force is trying to basically open my elbow. And that's where we get to this whole conversation around torque, right? Because force applied to the human body and through joints, in order to load muscles, we create torque around our joints. Well, we don't create it. The external world creates it. The dumbbell creates it. The machine creates it. The barbell creates it. And we, as a dumb monkey organism, respond. So if I'm doing a dumbbell curl, right, I don't choose to activate my biceps. My biceps essentially react to the force of the dumbbell, and more specifically, the torque of the dumbbell applied to my elbow. And when my brain recognizes that my elbow is being straightened by a resistance and I bend my elbow against that resistance, well, my brain can basically say, okay, biceps, brachialis, brachioradialis, they're all on board to do that. So if there were such a thing as basics, it would be rooted in physics. And further, within that sort of more generalized domain of physics, we have force and we have torque. And we can apply force and torque outside the body and inside the body. So if we're trying to understand, hey, how heavy is this dumbbell curl at what portion in the range of motion? We can easily identify that through looking at external torque. And if we want to say, okay, from an internal perspective, which muscles may be acting most directly against that torque? Well, from an internal perspective, we can look at force of muscles, tension is what we call it, mechanical tension. And we can look at the relative torques that those forces, those tensions are creating around the relevant joints. In the case of a curl, the elbow joint, the radio-ulnar joint, potentially the shoulder joint if you want to make a deeper analysis of the situation. So if there were basics, which there are, I think, it would not be in specific movements, right? The basics would need to be underneath of those movements. The basics would describe the things that people are calling basic. because basic cannot be a description of exercise names. If you say a squat is a basic exercise, I understand what people mean colloquially, right? But on any kind of useful level, it's like, okay, what do you mean by squat? Do you mean like barbell squat? Do you mean dumbbell squat? Do you mean hack squat, Smith squat? Oh, and what like technique do you use in the squat? Because you can make a squat do one thing a lot and you can make it do a very, very different thing. So to me, this whole basics concept falls short in the way that we're talking about it culturally, because we're not actually talking about basics. We're talking about things that the basics describe. And if you understand the fundamental level, the force, the torque inside and outside the body, then you can understand any exercise in any context, because you don't need to blindly subscribe to thinking that the basics are a set of prescriptions. They're not a set of prescriptions because by definition, they're more fundamental than any prescription that could possibly be created. And when you actually understand the basics, when you actually understand these principles of physics, you don't need to ever be concerned about names of exercises. Sure, naming exercises, it's convenient to discuss that, discuss exercise that way. It's convenient to be able to communicate. We're obviously not going to sit around and talk about, well, if I create a clockwise torque and I do, no, we just say biceps curl. Okay. So I'm not discounting that. But when we're trying to have useful discussions on any kind of technical level, on any kind of level that could actually help someone in practice, we need more than squat, hinge, push, pull, right? Because guess what? Plenty of people, myself included, do what other people say that they should do for years, all to no avail, not only with minimal muscle growth, minimal strength gain, but also with like maximal discomfort and maximal pain. Like I spent years of training just assuming that like those states of existence were normal because I was doing the things that other people told me that I needed to be doing and progressing in the ways that other people told me that I needed to be progressing. So the basics in essence, sure, you could get lucky, you listen to someone, you do a program, it works for you, it works forever. Cool. Guess what? You're a lucky one. Trust me, you're a lucky one, at least in some ways. But for any of you listening, and for any of you still watching at this point, take a little time to like learn something about force, whether it's through me directly in my courses, shout out to myself, or anyone else who's discussing this material. Like I honestly, to some degree, I don't care where it comes from. I just want people to start having like more useful discussions, more discussions that don't just result in like this kind of subjective circular definition, wheel where people are just going around in circles over and over saying the same things that everyone else has said for a very long time with no original thought or take of their own. Because in my estimation, the only way that you can actually start to think for yourself about these things and think in somewhat of an original way, whatever that means to you, is to actually understand the basics. Because in the most painful irony of all, if you just assume that the basics are a sequence of patterns or exercises, then you are by definition missing the material, the raw material that you could then craft into the best thing for you. So I hope this like conversation, argument doesn't just sound like pure pedantic nonsense, because I really don't think that it is. And I really think that anyone who takes training seriously, whether or not they understand the technical terms about force and what tension is as a force and what the differences between internal and external torque are, I don't think that you actually need to go that deep to the level of like describing the terms and knowing the definitions in a way where someone like who's in my position would need to know them. But at minimum, just having a fundamental understanding, like a truly fundamental understanding of how this stuff works, it can just a little bit can go such a long way. So if any of you want my advice in terms of like where to start, just learning a little bit about like force and like what the qualities of force are, learning a little bit about torque, like what is torque and why is it relevant to exercise, learning the sort of internal equivalence to that, and just most specifically trying to understand how to apply those things in the gym rather than just like leaving it at this very baseline discussion of like, what exercises should we do? Because on some level, I do agree that like all of the things that people list as basics are probably things that you're going to end up doing anyway. But understanding why that is the case is what makes the difference between someone who can intelligently navigate their own training, generally speaking, and someone who can't. And I want all of you to be able to utilize my channel in a way where you are actually creating more autonomy for yourselves, more agency for yourselves in the gym. I think everyone ends up just much better off that way. People in my position end up being asked much more interesting, better questions, and people in all of your positions who are maybe just viewers, watchers, maybe it's recreational for you, maybe you're a professional who wants to learn. Regardless, creating more agency and more sort of originality in you, that's the best case scenario for not only you, but for me and everyone else in this industry who is sort of contributing to this landscape. So anyway, those are just some rambly thoughts. I figured I'd keep doing these videos. If you have any thoughts, disagreements, comments, if you want to say, Ben, you're an asshole, you're being pedantic, do that too. You're entitled to do that. And yeah, as I said before, if any of you have specific requests insofar as like me rambling videos goes, please let me know.